Welcome back to Math 103. This is video number 4 on measuring power. Last time we were discussing our example of the New Jersey Advisory Committee, set up as a certain weighted voting system with quota and weights, and we asked, suppose that Northern and Central are in favor of a proposal while Southern is opposed. In other words, we are talking about the scenario described by the winning coalition consisting of N and C, but not S. And then we asked, if C switches sides from voting yes to voting no, does the proposal still pass? If C switches sides, then we are removing C from this winning coalition, and N is left alone, and the answer is no. The proposal does not still pass, since we're left with N as the only yes voter, and N by himself is not a winning coalition. Okay, so that is the thought process spelled out in terms of our notation. And so we can now consider another scenario in which all 3 committee members are in favor of a certain proposal. They are all voting yes. That scenario is described by the Grand Coalition, the winning coalition consisting of all the players. Now, if C switches sides, which is to say that C is no longer voting yes, so the yes voters are just N and S, we ask, does the proposal still pass? And the answer is yes, since the coalition consisting of just N and S is on our list of winning coalitions. Okay, so in the first instance, C really made a difference. Whether C was voting yes or not made all the difference in this scenario, where N is committed to voting yes and S is committed to voting no. C switching sides makes all the difference to whether this proposal passes. But in the other scenario, there are enough committed yes voters that C switching sides has no effect on whether the proposal still passes. Now we are ready to define a very important concept for this topic. Consider a particular winning coalition, and remaining focused just on that one winning coalition, we say that a player is critical. The player is a critical player for that specific winning coalition if that one player's departure from the coalition would change it from winning to losing. Okay, as we just saw, when the coalition consisted of just Northern and Central, if Central Jersey dropped out, that turned what had been a winning coalition now into a losing one. So we say that Central Jersey was critical in that winning coalition. In other words, if the decision of a player to stay and to continue to vote yes, or leave and switch to voting no, is critical to whether the motion passes, then we call the player a critical player. So in other words, the terminology critical is connected with the ordinary meaning, or one of the ordinary meanings of the word critical in ordinary English. Okay? So critical here, this is important, critical makes sense only in relation to a specific winning coalition. Now let's look again at the complete list of winning coalitions and underline the critical player or players in each one, in each winning coalition. Right, so first let's look at the Grand Coalition and ask, is N critical in the Grand Coalition? It does not make sense to ask, is N critical, period. It only makes sense to ask, is N critical in a specific winning coalition? So is N critical in this winning coalition? Well, we find that out by asking, what would be the effect of N quitting this winning coalition? That is, what would be the effect of N not voting yes? Well, the effect is that would leave C and S together voting yes, and since C and S do have enough votes together to pass a proposal, that means that N is not critical. We do not underline N. So N is not critical in the Grand Coalition, and similarly C is not critical in the Grand Coalition. If C dropped out and left just N and S voting yes, they would have enough votes just between the two of them to pass a proposal. We've seen that they, by themselves, N and S, form a winning coalition. Therefore, C was not critical here. They could live without C. Okay? Similarly, S is not critical in the grand coalition by the same reasoning. How about the coalition consisting of just N and C? Well, we saw a little bit earlier what would happen if C dropped out, and that would leave N alone voting yes. N alone does not have enough votes to pass a motion. And the conclusion is that C is critical in this winning coalition. This coalition cannot win without C. It depends on C. In that sense, C is critical here. It makes sense in the ordinary sense of the word critical, that C is critical to the success of this winning coalition. And by the same reasoning, N is critical here. This winning coalition cannot remain a winning coalition unless N stays around and continues to vote yes. Great, so we now have an example of a winning coalition in which both members are critical. By the same reasoning, once again, this winning coalition depends on the participation of both its members. If either one were to quit, then the winning coalition would cease to be winning. So it needs N to stick around and vote yes, therefore N is critical. It also needs S to stick around and continue to vote yes, so S is critical. Once again, by the same reasoning, C is critical and also S is critical in this last winning coalition. It makes sense that among these two-member winning coalitions, both members would be critical, because there's no such thing in this example as a one-person winning coalition. Okay? So no one can single-handedly pass proposals. Therefore, in those scenarios where there are only two yes voters, they really both better stick around and continue to be yes voters if this proposal is really going to pass. I also emphasize that in this analysis that we've just done, when we determined whether a player was critical in a certain winning coalition, for example, when we determined that N is critical in this winning coalition, we were looking at one player at a time. We were covering up N, as it were, looking at the remaining player, namely C, and asking, is the remaining coalition still a winning coalition? So we were only asking about N's status at that moment, N and only N, and we concluded that N is critical here. Then we separately looked just at C's status. We covered up C and asked only about the criticality of C here. So we always look one player at a time inside one winning coalition. We take our list of all the winning coalitions and all the critical players underlined, and we proceed to ask a crucial set of questions. What is the total number of instances in which some player, any player at all, was critical? The answer there is we just count up the number of underlines, and we conclude that the answer is 6. There are 6 instances of criticality. We go on to now ask, in what fraction of these instances of someone being critical was N critical, in what fraction was C critical, and in what fraction of them was S critical? Okay, so in the case of N, well, there are 1, 2 out of those 6 in which N is critical, so that's 2 out of 6. Similarly for C, 2 out of 6. There are 2 instances in which C is critical, out of 6 total. And finally, for S, there are also 2 instances of criticality, 2 instances of being a critical player. That's great. There are 6 instances in which some player is critical in a winning coalition, but what does this all really mean? Banzhaf's viewpoint, and this is very important, is that every instance of criticality, every instance of someone being critical in a winning coalition, is an instance of actual power being exercised. That's how you tell when actual influence is being exercised, when someone has actual power. Now, in this example, we figured out that there are 6 such instances, 6 opportunities, as it were, for an individual to really make the difference between a proposal passing and not passing. So in that conception of power, there are 6 instances in which actual power is being exercised by an individual. Now, this is only one viewpoint, but it is a very important viewpoint on what it means to exercise power. This brings us to the key question: what fraction of the actual power does each individual player possess? Now, there are several approaches, including Banzhaf's, that want to think of measuring power in terms of a fraction of all the power. Right? Think of all the power that's being exercised by anyone at all as a kind of pie that is being split up in a certain way among the players. So these various approaches have different ways of asking, what fraction of the time that power is being exercised is it exercised by one particular player? So if you want to know one particular player's share of the power, you ask what fraction of all the power is being controlled by that one specific player. So what does that mean for Banzhaf, who cares about critical players in winning coalitions? He's going to ask, of all the instances in which anyone at all is critical, in what fraction of those is that particular player critical? So in our example of a weighted voting system, this committee, where we've already listed all the winning coalitions and critical players, we found that each player was critical in 2 out of these 6 instances. So there were 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 opportunities for an individual to exercise power. And what piece of the pie does N get? Well, N has 2/6 of all the power. In other words, 1/3 of all the power. C has 2/6, that is to say 1/3 of all the power. And S has 2/6, which is again 1/3 of all the instances of someone being critical, and therefore 2/6, 1/3 of all the actual power. So from Banzhaf's point of view, each player has 1/3 of the actual power on this committee. It's worth remarking here that Banzhaf's approach here reached the same conclusion that we did earlier. So he concludes that all 3 committee members are in reality equally powerful on this committee, in spite of having different numbers of votes. So that business about the 4 to 3 to 2 ratio of votes did not result in an actual distribution of power that we thought it would. Okay, great. So we reasoned out the same conclusion earlier. This approach to measuring power in a weighted voting system, based specifically on critical players in winning coalitions, was in fact used by John Banzhaf in successful court challenges to the constitutionality of certain proportional voting systems, very much like the one just analyzed in that New Jersey Advisory Committee example. So he was dealing with districts in a county which were receiving a certain number of votes in a proportional voting scheme, but when you did the actual analysis, according to his method, it turned out that they were being shortchanged. You can go to court and make a flowery speech, but if you can have a mathematical argument that your client is getting a raw deal, you are likely to be more persuasive. And in fact, his argument was persuasive, and the court ruled in his favor. We give a name to this fraction of all the power that we've been computing. So in a weighted voting system, the Banzhaf power index of a single player is a measure of that player's share of the actual power, expressed as a fraction or as a percentage. Either one is fine. To compute this value, to compute this fraction or percentage, what do? We list all the winning coalitions. It's important that we list all of them. We underline the critical players in each winning coalition, and then a particular player's Banzhaf power index equals this fraction right here. The number of times the player is critical divided by the total number of times anybody at all is critical. Or equivalently, the number of times that particular player is underlined divided by the total number of times that somebody is underlined. Our last piece of terminology here, the Banzhaf power distribution, just means the listing together of each player's Banzhaf power index. So the Banzhaf power distribution of the weighted voting system that we've been discussing quota 5, weights 4, 3, and 2 is as follows. So Northern Jersey with weight 4 has Banzhaf power index 1/3. Just to be clear, we computed it originally as 2/6. You can leave it as 2/6 if you want, but it's polite to simplify that to 1/3. C, Central New Jersey, we reasoned out, also has 2 out of 6 instances of criticality, and similarly S, Southern Jersey, has 2/6 of the actual power. It's crucial that that is what these numbers really mean. This means 1/3 of the actual power, not 1/3 of the votes, not 1/3 of the total weight. It means 1/3 of the actual power. That's crucial. That's the whole point. We remarked earlier that although the quota needs to be at least 5, which is to say more than half the total weight of the weighted voting system, more than half of the total number of votes, there is no reason why it would need to be exactly 5. It can be greater than 5. It could, for example, be 6. It could be that someone says, let's hold out for a higher level of agreement among the committee members before anything is allowed to pass. So with that in mind, before going on to the next video, find the Banzhaf power distribution of our new weighted voting system that we'll look at now, 6:432. And after you've found the Banzhaf power distribution here, the follow-up question is, what new role does Northern New Jersey have in the dynamics of forming winning coalitions?